left there. The terns are in the right, sorry, the bottom left.
Oh, marble murrelet.
Yeah, marble murrelets. So that's a species we have off our coast. They, like most seabirds, spend their entire life at sea, and when they go to nest, they nest in elevated platforms in trees, usually old-growth trees. There are some native tribes, like the Haida Gwaii, others in Southeast Alaska, that knew about the life cycle of these birds. For Western science, we went to the moon before we made the connection between these birds we saw in the ocean and where they actually nested. So until like the late 70s, early 80s, we started realizing that they nest in old growth trees. So that is to say, that seabirds are very diverse, and there's a lot we're still learning about them. These are all species that are, some of these are common off our coast, some of these are not common off our coast, but I will give you a rundown of what we have here. So the top left corner, does anyone know what that is? Yeah, shearwater, and then top middle,
Ground
pelican. Top right, this is a
Tern.
Jaeger one. So they are similar to terns. We see them rarely off our coast, but you know them when you see them because at first they look like a gull, and then you're like, that thing is way too snappy, and it looks like it could just take out a gull, which they do. That's a pomegranate Jaeger, and they nest in Alaska and then come down here in the summer. And then we know our marbled murrelets. In the middle there are Brandt's cormorants, and then above them is a California gull. And gulls are kind of, they can get in that gray area. California gulls, we see them off our coast. Some of them, like other seabirds, spend almost their entire lives at sea. But also California gulls breed in Mona Lake and are completely inland. So they, there's always exceptions to the rules. But for the most part, seabirds are ones that rely on the marine environment. And what's cool about studying seabirds is that they are unique in that they spend almost their entire lives at sea, but then they come back to land. So for those of us who are interested in studying the marine environment, they can be pretty good indicators of what's going on out there because they'll bring that information back to where we can study them. So in the top left corner here, it's hard to tell, but all those little black and white dots are common murres. And then in the foreground are two pigeon guillemots. This is Southeast Farallon Island, for any of you guys who are familiar with the Farallones. But it's, so you just have these, this influx of information from the marine environment coming to these colonies to breed. And then, again, that's a Caspian tern in the right, and it's carrying a juvenile salmon. So there's can be interactions between seabirds and really important forage fish for us, and studying that interaction can be interesting. Not surprisingly, seabirds face threats. So bycatch is a big problem that we see with seabirds, getting caught in long line fishing, for example. But there are efforts to, as you can see with those streamers along that long line, there in the bottom left, there are ways to deter birds from lines or make fishing practices safer with regards to seabirds. Seabirds are also vulnerable to oil spills. So in the middle there, you have a common murre with oil on its chest. Once they get covered in oil, they're no longer waterproof and have a lot harder time staying warm in the marine environment. So oil spills is another big problem. And then they're also, because seabirds mostly nest on islands, they're not adapted to a lot of the predators that are on mainlands. So when animals like cats or rats get introduced to islands, it can be devastating for the seabirds because they're not used to defending themselves against them. So again, it's hard to see in the bottom right there, but that's a public like a PSA announcement at a seabird or a bird like sanctuary island off of New Zealand, and it's basically telling people to check for the introduction of mice and rats as well as seeds, so invasive species to the islands, really trying to keep the islands protected from those species. And the one cool thing about protecting seabirds from introduced predators, removing predators from islands, is you can see cascading effects. So once predators are removed and seabirds are brought back, the entire ecosystem benefits from that, even down to the coral reefs. So there's been studies in the tropics of removing rats from islands, seabird populations bounce back up, and then the coral reefs are like, they regrow as well. So it's a pretty cool, there's some success stories out there, which is always great. One new player in the seabird world is offshore wind energy development. So this is an interesting one in that it's addressing some of the negative effects we're seeing on seabirds as well as everything, climate change, but it's a development in their marine habitat. So what does that mean for those birds? That's one thing that we're interested in studying.
Those count as old growth trees?
Yeah. Some birds might think so. So our work at the USGS, our research focuses on developing innovative tools, methods, and analyses to more effectively monitor and assess seabird ecology, distribution, and abundance. So our methods range from observing birds from either boats or planes to fancier methods such as attaching GPS units to the birds and tracking their movements. We work directly with collaborators both within the government and outside to inform marine planning as well as management decisions of seabird habitats. And our work ranges along the west coast of the US. Also, we work in Hawaii, but I'm going to focus on kind of the work off of California that we do, because as you guys probably know, California is a great place to be a seabird. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this.
What kind of
Good
bird?
place to be a human too.
Yes.
What bird was in
exactly.
your hand in that last one?
That is a Cassin's auklet chick.
Wow.
The one in my hand right above the USGS.
Yeah. So what?
It's a Cassin's auklet chick. Cassin's auklets are related to puffins.
Where did you get that one?
Where'd
you get it? Like this is there?
Yeah.
It lives there?
That one is found, yes, they breed on Monuno Nuevo Island.
Oh.
That picture is from the Channel Islands down south, but
Yeah.
they can see them on that coast for sure. Yeah, so one of the most shocking seabird experiences you can have in the Santa Cruz area is when the city shearwaters come in the summer. And they have a pretty incredible story. This is a map shows tracking of shearwaters from their breeding colonies off of New Zealand. And the colors are showing seasons of a year. So it's tracking their movement to the northern hemisphere during the summer, to spend the summer off our coast, and then heading back down to breed. So these birds are traveling about 40,000 miles round trip, just like 2 laps around the earth. And they find that journey to be the most effective way for them to actually get good food sources. So they're traveling that far to forage off our coasts. And you guys might be familiar with why. So off of our coast, we have the California current system, which is a unique pattern of atmospheric pressure and the associated winds along the west coast that drive upwelling of nutrients within the water and enable this area to host a wealth of marine life.
Can I ask a question about their patterns?
Yeah.
Have they changed at all? I mean, these are ingrained patterns
Mm-hmm.
for decades and centuries, maybe. I don't know, but has that changed over time recently?
That's a really good question and a hard one to answer because although the patterns of these few birds we were actually able to put tags on, we think it's representative of, or I wish I'd done that work, but that, we think is representative of what they're doing. I mean, we know they come off our coast, but it's such a small number of birds that it would, there hasn't been any, study of whether that it has, ongoing studies have not really been able to occur.
So I have a question too.
Yeah.
My understanding was that they do this sort of a zigzaggy pattern as they're crossing from New Zealand up to here. And for those tracks that I see, it looks like some of them are sort of direct, but then others are going way out to sea, the middle of the Pacific, and then dropping down. But did you find, is this Scott Schaefer?
Yeah.
Okay. So did he find that they were taking one pattern on the way north and another pattern on the way south, or?
Yeah, good question. It seemed that they, on the way south, they're traveling a lot more direct. It was like a beeline back to the colony. And they're more likely to take indirect routes to that.
Was that because of the currents
with
and
weather?
Yeah.
Yeah, just like if you were sailing.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure, yeah.
I know I hate sailing north, so.
Yeah.
That's because of
Yeah.
politics. Though.
You guys have insights on some super biologists. Yeah.
Are any of them, is there something built in that takes them back to specific places? Or is that a learned thing from their parents, for instance?
It's thought to be built in. That's getting a little outside of my expertise, but I think it's some sort of magnetic thing.
It's kind of like the monarch butterfly.
Yeah, and it is in that they nest in burrows, and then once the chicks are ready to fledge, it's kind of bright lights, big city. I'm sure there's social, they have maybe take some social cues, but they essentially figure out how to do this on their own.
Aren't there a bunch of shearwaters in the south of Australia and things like that?
Yeah.
Are they the sooties or are they something?
They are, mostly other species. I can't think of off the top of my head, but yeah. And then off our coast, another common, not as common, but species you might see are pink-footed shearwaters. They have the lighter undersides. You'll see them kind of with the cities, and they nest off almost exclusively off of Chile. So there are a lot of other species shearwater species that do something similar.
So all we see is sooties, shearwaters in our area?
Almost always, yeah.
No,
So
sorry,
you're
but
saying
I see
that,
a lot of difference.
you're saying that the orange, they're leaving New Zealand area and going for summer grounds up north, and the same bird is going down in the yellow,
Mm-hmm.
late summer maybe, and then the winter is the blue, and that's one migration 40,000 miles
Mm-hmm.
in
With
1 year.
one bird, with one
Yeah.
population of bird
Wow.
through their lifespan.
Yeah,
Wow.
they do it every summer.
Wow.
How long do they live?
Yeah, how long do they live?
Oh, that's a good question. I think 30 something years. Yeah, they're long-lived birds.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Any other questions about Seabirds? Okay,
Oh, do you know what's their latest population?
that is a really good question. I don't know. It's really hard. There are some people who it's kind of anecdotal, but are saying we're seeing less off of our coasts.
We are.
Yeah.
Around here.
So. Yeah, what that means, who knows? But going back to our coast. So yeah, this California current system is what makes it such a great place to be both a seabird and other marine animals. This is why we get to see this off our coast. The map there on the left shows the average wind patterns in the U.S. ocean. So the EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, goes out to 200 nautical miles. That's the line you see right there, and that's showing wind patterns within our waters, which is great for these species, and it also has potential for California energy goals, which is to be completely 100% renewable energy by 2045. For context, when that mandate was put in 2018, we were at 34% renewable energy. So obviously we have a way to go, and wind energy, including offshore wind, is expected to feature prominently in that strategy. So what does that look like? So another bureau within the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, is responsible for leasing these offshore areas within the EEZ to offshore drilling, sand mining, all sorts of stuff, but also to renewable energy. So these are 3 areas that they've identified off the California coast. So the one on the left there is off of Humboldt County, right off of Humboldt Bay, and then on the right are 2 spots off of South Central California, so Morro Bay and Diablo Canyon. And these are areas that they identified based on looking at shipping routes, where the Navy has practices, where the fishing industry is, and then also looking at marine resources, including environmental resources, including seabirds. These are the spots they first identified. They also worked with scientists, including ourselves, to try to learn more about potential impacts as they move forward with these call areas. This basically refers to call for proposals from energy companies to put a bid into developing these areas. So still very early in the process, but this is what the offshore renewable energy is looking like in California currently.
I can't see the scale of offshore.
They're about, yeah, it's hard to tell. They're about 20 nautical miles.
It's the dotted line of 3 or 12 miles.
The dotted line is 3, so that's state waters.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the
That's on
top
scale.
scale bar is nautical miles. That's 0, 10, 20. So that is a 20 miles. So 20 miles from nearest land.
You want one of these?
Oh yeah.
Green ones, just center one.
Center, okay, cool. Yeah, so this scale bar up here is nautical miles, 0 to 20. And these, because of our continental shelf, these, when, whatever it is, they do build windmills out there, they'll be floating because it's so deep. And that technology is just getting to the point where it would be viable. But it is unique. Where you have offshore wind currently, mostly in the North Sea, it's very shallow, so they're actually like pile-mounted turbines. This would be totally different. And the technology is just mind-boggling. The turbines are the size of the Seattle Space Needle, and each blade is the length of a football field. So these are going to be very large turbines.
On a floating platform.
On floating platforms.
Are they floating all the birds that come by, that fly in?
We'll talk about that.
Okay, that was my
Yeah,
question.
okay.
This is about
So,
I bet I can make that work.
yeah, so what does offshore wind energy mean for seabirds? We can kind of break it down into 2 categories. The one that you're most likely to think of is collision with blades and infrastructure, which could be a concern. The other one that's a little more nuanced, but potentially more significant, is displacement. So that figure on the right shows these are radar tracks of water birds through a wind farm. So the red dots are turbines, and the black lines are bird movements. And what you see is that the birds are avoiding the turbines altogether. And this is something that has been observed a lot now that offshore wind has been in the North Sea for a while. So that's great for collision risk. We think that most species don't want anything to do with the turbines.
Right.
That being said, if that wind farm is located in a place that was important for those birds, either to commute through or to forage, a place that they foraged, that displacement could have other effects on the species there. So working with the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, we want to take a first stab at kind of like, what does this mean for species off our coast? And we followed kind of what had been done both in countries around the North Sea as well as off our Atlantic coast, which is a little bit ahead of us in wind farm development, and essentially created these vulnerability equations that are based on everything we know about these species and how we think that translates to their vulnerability to offshore wind. And what is the relative vulnerability of these species? Which ones should we be most concerned about? So there's the equation for collision vulnerability. So how high do they fly off the water? Are they sensitive to displacement from an area? Do they fly at night when they potentially couldn't see as well? That sort of stuff. And then an equation for displacement vulnerability. Again, how sensitive are they to disturbance? Also, how flexible are they in the habitats they can use? That sort of thing. And then because all of kind of our thinking about vulnerability depends so much on the species itself, we also calculated population vulnerability. So that's what percent of the population is in the California current, how big is the population in general, and what's their vulnerability status, is there anything else that would potentially make them more or less vulnerable. So we use these equations for the 81 seabird and also marine water bird species that we find off our coast, looking at over 200 published literature sources, and came out with our best guess at relative vulnerability, which is that it's complicated. So in these graphs, along the y-axis, we have that population vulnerability metric. So how vulnerable is the population in question? And along the x-axis, in the left-hand graph, we have the collision vulnerability metric, and in the right-hand graph, we have the displacement vulnerability metric. And I apologize, it's very hard to see, but basically they're color-coded by species group. So I'll point out a couple. Maybe if you can see.
Wait, just for those folks that don't know X from Y, maybe you'd like to explain that.
Y-axis, thank you. Y-axis, population vulnerability. So again, on this axis, and then collision vulnerability from low to high here, displacement vulnerability from low to high here. And each dot represents a species. They're color-coded so that, for example, these red dots here, can everyone see the red?
Yes.
Okay, I realize that's not, hopefully none of you are colorblind, I apologize. Red is gulls. So these are all the gull species we see. They'd be relatively vulnerable to collision. They fly fairly high. They're not that likely to be deterred from somewhere. On the flip side, they don't look like they're going to be too vulnerable to displacement from wind energy. It gets interesting so these orange, that's the two pelican species we see. Brown pelicans, also white pelicans were included here. We rarely see them off the coast, and brown pelicans, you don't see them, like, once you get out there, they're not there, right? So once you're actually looking, once we start applying this to actual locations in the ocean, that story would change. And is something we're actively working on now. But what we did right here is kind of the first quantitative, or it is the first quantitative evaluation of potential vulnerability of these species to offshore wind energy. And so that's great. It gives us somewhere to start with what species we might want to pay particular attention to when we're talking about offshore wind. One species that jumps out on both of these is this gray dot up here. That is our friend the ashy storm petrel. And what you can see is not, for collision vulnerability, not pretty low, their displacement, their potential vulnerability to displacement might be high, but what we really see is that based on our calculations, their population characteristics might make them vulnerable. So what does that mean? Essentially, that means that their entire population is in the California current. So for this broad area that we were talking about, they're all there, so they all would potentially be vulnerable. Again, once you start looking at specific locations, that could change. But we do see them in Monterey Bay. Has anyone seen flocks of ashy storm petrels in the fall, usually? So they're related to a shearwater or an albatross, but they're quite small. They're about the size of a swallow. There's thought to be about 8,000 of them, all found off our coasts. They breed on offshore rocks and islands between April and October, which is a pretty prolonged breeding season. But unlike the shearwater, they're not constrained by a huge migration. So they can be a little more lax about when they breed, because they're just gonna stay in this wonderful nutrient area. Yeah. When they do come back to their breeding colony, colony is a generous term. They might breed near each other, but they all breed in like small crevices in rock faces. And they'll come back to their colony at night, which is thought to be protection against potential predators. And then other than that, they're spending their life out just at sea. They're also thought to live till be pretty long-lived until they're in their 30s. And to put that in perspective, this is, again, on the Farallon Islands. Has anyone sailed to the Farallon Islands? It's a gorgeous sail. Yeah, that's great. So these are all, for those of you who have been out there, there are a lot of seabirds. And these are all the species that breed on the Farallon Islands. And this is by their mass, so the average mass of the birds. So the big ones are your cormorants, big hefty birds, this small little pink flat skulls, and then within them, puffins, rhinoceros auklets, pigeon guillemots, cats auklets, and then this tiny little yellow dot is your ashy storm petrel. So it's pretty incredible that that tiny little bird can spend its entire life at sea and live for so long.
That's a lot of flying.
Yeah. They do breed on the Farallon Islands, but a lot of their habitat is something like this. So here is an ashy storm petrel in this little crevice. And that crevice is on Stormy Stack, which is a little rock off of Point Reyes. So breeding in these locations and flying into these locations at night makes them very challenging for those of us who are interested in studying them. But they have partly because they're so unique to our coast. They have been pretty well studied, starting in the 70s. So we'll start with what we know. This map shows all of the known breeding locations of ashy storm petrels. And the size of the dot is the size of the colony, so that big orange dot is Southeast Farallon Island. And then in the Channel Islands, where you have Channel Islands National Park and protection and infrastructure for monitoring there, we have some good colonies that we know a lot about. And then up and down the coast, we have these little ones that the green means that it was a nest crevice was found. And then the purple means that there was some sign of presence on these offshore rocks. So there's it runs the gamut as far as what we know about the colonies where these birds breed. So the well-studied ones, offshore rocks where someone's been to, in Baja, they've gotten their capacity for studying their offshore islands has been increasing over the past couple of decades, which is really exciting. So we're starting to learn more down there from our colleagues. But the the breadth of the diversity of the locations in which they breed and diversity and access to these locations means that we have to be creative in how we study them. So the methods of the traditional method that was first used was just searching for nests. So we know they nest in rocks and crevices, so just get on the islands and look. The next method that was implemented was mist netting. So this is something that's done for songbirds on land a lot, but it's setting up this net and looking at the birds that come into it. And then the method that we've been implementing in the last 5 years or so is acoustic monitoring. So using acoustic units to listen for them. So we'll run through these really quick, or not so quick. The first we'll get deeper as we go through the method. So nest searching is exactly what it sounds like. Just getting off on all these offshore rocks on the islands and just looking around. Not all the habitat is accessible, but you search for what is accessible. And you go during the breeding season when you're most likely to see signs of birds. So actual birds sitting in a nest, eggshells, guano. And the cool thing about storm petrels, like the other shearwaters and albatrosses, they have a really distinct smell. It's like a musky scent, a musky fishy scent. And often you can smell them before, you'll smell a burrow and you think, oh, there's a bird nearby, and then you search and you find it. It's pretty impressive. So it really is just using all your senses.
But boat-wise, how do you safely get on these places?
Okay. Yeah, good question.
We're your PFD, that's for sure.
Yeah. So not OSHA.
You fall in the grass.
Exactly. Grass PFD.
Okay, now mist netting. So this is a method to catch the birds when they're coming into the colonies at night. In this figure, you can just make out the net. So there's this pole right here, there's a pole on the other side, and then there's this thin mesh net strung in between. So you're catching the birds as they won't see the net and they'll fly into it. To assure that you catch them, you draw them in. So we have an audio system playing actually Storm Petrel's greatest hits. And they are, because they spend so much of their lives alone, they do cue into hearing other calls of their same species, and they'll come in and catch them. Once you catch the bird, you can put a band on it, which allows you to that's how we know how old they can get, whether they travel between colonies, and get some idea of their survival rates by looking at how often we recapture banded birds. You can also measure their mass and their the length of their wing and that sort of thing, and the mass compared, the weight of the bird compared to the length of its wing or its leg can tell you how healthy it is. So whether it's skinny or like a skinny bird or a nice, happy, healthy bird. You can also look at, they have a lot of bird species will lose the feathers on their stomach when they're incubating an egg to get really direct heat flow to their egg. So then they call it a brood patch. When they're brooding an egg, they get a bare patch on their stomach. So you can also look for a brood patch on the bird, and it's not that they might get a brood patch even if they're not incubating an egg, but it's a pretty good indication of whether they're on an egg or not. And both males and females will get it because they share that responsibility. So misnetting is
How unusual.
Misnetting is great. There's a lot you can learn from it about the actual birds because you can hold them. It is really labor intensive. A lot of long nights, usually working from sundown to about 2 a.m. catching birds. And some of these sites can be hard to get to. So valuable information, but it has its limitations. So always looking for new ways.
Are the birds friendly? Like, do they let you grab them?
Thank you for bringing that up. There is concern that it's pretty stressful for them. Unlike some seabird species, actually storm petrels, when they bite you, it's just cute. They're just like, they can't do any harm. And you're like, yeah, they do have personalities, and the fighters are just, it's hard not to just think they're adorable. But most of them, are pretty, you can tell they're pretty stressed out. So obviously it's not ideal. So the new kid on the block is using these acoustic units to essentially listen at colonies. We're still kind of learning what we can really gather from that, but we do know it works. So these units, this is the green unit is the acoustic monitor. If any of you guys have played with like game cameras, trail cameras, it looks very similar, but instead of a camera, it's got microphones on either side, and then we've attached them to these battery boxes so we can leave them out for long periods of time. But basically, you just set this unit to record like a set amount of time. So for actually storm petrels, we have to record 1 minute every 5 minutes from sunset to sunrise. What we did to kind of just understand what we could learn from these units is we put them out throughout the actual storm petrel range and focusing on these offshore rocks and islands. So these are part of the California Coastal National Monument. This is a new national monument that we don't really know much about, and it's managed by BLM, like other national monuments, but they're interested in what resources do we have out there, one of which is seabirds. So we deployed these in 2017, 2018 at a lot of offshore rocks to see what we could learn.
Isn't San Clemente a test range?
Oh, yeah, okay, good point. So these, San Nicolas and Santa Barbara, so this is San Clemente down here, yes, it's Navy. San Nicolas is also Navy. So, and then you'll see also on here, Año Nuevo. So some of these sites were not within the California Coastal National Monument, but were comparison sites for ones that were. So we knew, or we were curious, since we were throwing units out, how these sites compared. And honestly, San Nic was fairly, and San Clemente, sorry. Both of them were opportunistic in that the Navy let us do it, so we jumped on it, but it is cool, because the Navy also has interest in what they have, what resources they can be worried about, yeah.
So, just the technology is fascinating, but isn't it possible to do like time-lapse sonography, like we do time-lapse photography, or not?
Essentially, so are you talking about,
Lapse over time, like, so you can just like
kind of stitch it all
focus
together?
in, yeah.
Yeah, and that's basically what it is. I'll get into, first I'm gonna talk about the deployments, but then I will talk about kind of how you analyze all that
Data.
yeah. Yeah, the sites that aren't Navy islands, or something like this. So that's the Bixby Bridge. And this is Castle Rock, I think. But yeah, so there I am. How do I get there? We call it the bump and jump. So we use the Zodiac. And kind of case out what's the closest place we can launch from these islands, and then go out and wait for the swell to be right, and then you jump out. And this is how the original nest searches were done. And while we're out there, we do those traditional searches, but instead of just getting that snapshot in time, we then can be collecting data for the entire season until we go back out and pick up the unit again.
So that's you?
That's me, yeah.
Where did that Zodiac launch from?
From
Monterey or off of?
from Pebble Beach.
From Pebble Beach?
It's a long run.
Yeah. Wow.
She's ready for race committee.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Mark said.
Yeah. It is. That's probably the worst thing getting off. But you just, it takes good communication between the person at the helm.
You ever get down?
I have not. We did. This Audubon got interested in this story, and so we had a reporter and photographer come out with us, and the photographer fell. But all this stuff was fine.
Luckily, you were the first one off the boat.
Yeah, just because they did a really good job. He took it like a champ.
How about his equipment?
It was Pelican case and in a dry bag. So
Nice.
it was good.
He's looking at this going.
So this is the view from a really great deployment. So this is Piedras Blancas Light Station. I believe you guys are familiar. So south end of Big Sur. This is their unit deployed. There's my coworker patiently waiting for me, and this is on the leeward side of the island. So it's protected from wind noise, which could make it harder to hear other things. Also, it was in what we thought was good ashes perpetual habitat, so a lot of little crevices where we thought they would nest. And sure enough, just below where the unit was deployed, we did find a couple nests. So this is actually some abandoned eggs, so not a successful nesting attempt, but they were nesting right here. And we really don't know. We think that these units can hear in about a 30-foot radius if they have fairly good acoustic conditions. So not a lot of wind noise or wave noise, but we really don't know. So it's, that's one of the many things we're kind of trying to figure out. But knowing that nests were nearby kind of that is a good data point, because then we should hear them.
So can you retrieve the data remotely, or you have to just go physically?
I have to go get it, yeah. This was not as easy to access site, but it made for a really cool photo. And this unit, we actually didn't This one got lost.
Oh.
So some of them were in better spots than others. But for the most part, it was successful, and we only lost 2 units over 2 years, so that was pretty good. And so then we came back to Santa Cruz with these guano-covered boxes, and we gave them to our friends at Conservation Metrics, which is a company based out of Long Rain Lab that focuses, that their specialty is analyzing data like this. So how they do it is by identifying, this is a spectrogram. So this is frequency in hertz, and this is time over about 2 seconds. And this is an ashy storm petrel call. So it creates this really unique pattern. And then essentially it works like, so then they use machine learning to pull out all the calls they want. And it essentially works like Siri or Alexa in that you give the computer a whole bunch of examples of what you're looking for, and you give them a whole bunch of examples of what you're not looking for, so like wind noise, wave noise, gull, that sort of thing, and it can start to decipher. So, and this is where I did have audio.
Do you want to turn it on?
Yeah, we'll give it a try. So on the top there, that's the spectrogram of the ashy storm petrel, and then this is 3 other storm petrel species that are similar, but they do sound different. So let's see if we can get that to work. Oh yeah, is it going on? Yeah. I don't even know which ones it's playing right now.
Alexa will tell you.
Yeah, exactly. Here, try this again. That's an ashy storm petrel, gorgeous noise. And then it sounds different from other storm petrels.
Bird language.
Cool. Yeah, so those are just, they make unique noises. The Conservation Metrics has developed algorithms to pull these noises out. They do then actually have a real person go in and verify on like on a sample of the calls that are pulled out to kind of get that check of the system. But that is how the analysis happens. And there's then a lot you can do with that data. But the first thing we did was just, for all these sites, how did what we found on the acoustic units compare to what was found by good old-fashioned nest searching? So what we found up here, this is in Humboldt and Delaware County. They had never been, ashy storm petrels aren't thought to go beyond on the point there. So they hadn't been found previously. We didn't find them in our acoustic units. But for places where they had been found before, we heard them on the acoustic units. And then for some places where storm petrel evidence had been found but hadn't been identified as species, we were able to confirm, yes, it was an ashy storm petrel, or no, it was another storm petrel. So in conclusion, this species like ashy storm petrel creates the life history of the bird, how much time it spends out at sea, how hard it is to study, creates challenges for us as when we study them, but through traditional methods, trying to keep those methods going, and also experimenting with new methods, we can both continue to monitor how the species is doing, and also monitor changes. There's probably a lot there. We don't even know everything that we could learn from the acoustic units, so that's exciting because it's just so much more data ever been able to get before. So, in conclusion, that's 2 examples of the kind of work that we do on Seabirds. And it is not just me, so this is my team at the USGS, and then also it's all of our collaborators as well on both of these projects. So big thanks to them. And then this is, Kira mentioned this, but this was the Audubon article about the Ashley Storm Petrel work. And she did a much better job than I did explaining how the machine learning stuff works. So that, take any questions.
You collaborate with Point Blue. You also send your data to Cornell? Share data?
No, it's all, we just collaborate with conservation metrics locally for the audio stuff.
Tell us about your background and how you got into this.
Good question. So I went to school at University of Puget Sound up in Washington State, and there is a professor there that studies seabirds, and I got a grant one summer to go out to islands off of the coast of Washington, and I was like, I could do this as a job, and so I've kind of just sought it out ever since. Yeah.
Did you ever do field work on Farallon Islands?
Yes, so through Point Blue, Point Blue Conservation Science, which is based out of Petaluma, they've had researchers nonstop on the Farallon Islands since the 70s. It's a pretty incredible place to work. And I did research out there for my master's, which I did at San Jose State with Scott Schaefer. I spent the spring and summer of 2012 and 2013 and a little bit of 2014 looking out there.
Does your nose still work?
You know, smelling my clothes after I got back was pretty shocking. Like, you really do get desensitized.
Oh, and actually, storm petrels don't migrate large distances, but what's a good time of year for us to hope to see them?
Yeah, good question. So, you guys spend more, you definitely spend more time on Monterey Bay than I do. So, but my understanding is that you can see rafts of them on Monterey Bay in the fall. So that's after they're done breeding, they'll tend to congregate into groups. Does anyone have any actual places that you see them on the bay or anything to add?
I just see them out in the middle of the bay, and it's usually like, it'll be so sporadic and really ephemeral. Like, I'll see it for a few days, and I'll see like more than one. Oh, cool! There's some fluttering around, and I think it's fall and winter. That's my recollection. So you can't satellite tag these guys. They're just too little, aren't they?
You can, but you're so limited by how small they are.
Yeah.
You can put tags on them. You can put telemetry tags on them. So you can put tags that you have to then have a unit out there too. Right. Which you can learn some things from. If you have a unit on the colony. I mean, another thing that we're talking about is if there are a whole bunch of structures out there with turbines on them, then you have other places out in the ocean that can essentially be picking up tag readings. So, and also that information would be really informative because that would say that those birds are near these structures. So it's been done a little bit, but what the information you're able to gain from putting a tag on the storm petrel is so limited that most people don't think it's worth the disturbance you cause them.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they're so tiny.
Yeah.
I have a question, can I ask a question about a different species?
Yes.
So the offshore wind turbines, and I was having trouble reading the little colored dots.
Yeah.
But how do albatross fit into that?
Yeah, good question. So, I'll go back up there and show you where the albatross are. Basically, they're albatross are tricky because there's so few of them off our coast, but you know, impacting one of them makes a big difference for the whole population, because especially something like short-tailed albatross, there's just so few of them left. They, though, as you probably know, rarely leave like right at water level. They're usually right kind of at the water level. So the thought being that they wouldn't hit a propeller, but we don't know. So albatrosses are the light blue dots. So here and there and there. So this would be your short-tailed albatross, which is critically endangered, and then laysan and blackfoot here, and then those two and kind of in the mix. So not super vulnerable to either collision or displacement is our thought, as mostly because they're going to be so close to the water. But another interesting point to make is that a lot of our research on actually studying seabirds and offshore wind energy is in the North Sea, where they do not have albatross. So we really don't know yet. Yes.
If they were not affected by the propeller per se, but the noise.
Yeah, and that is something that's really hard to study, and so they might, and we don't know yet. But there is, I don't have any examples exactly of how you study noise, but there are some things that we'll just have to learn along the way. Yeah.
So Alfred Hitchcock locally did the Birds movies,
Yes.
right? And so in his film, he alleged that when they're out there flying on the ocean and diving for a fish, that they were attacking people. But was that just all an example of fake news? Something they really knew?
I mean, being in seabird colonies such as the Farallon Islands, especially around gulls during the breeding season, they're very protective of their nests. And so that it wasn't a huge stretch of it wasn't a terrible stretch of the imagination, but it wouldn't happen unless you're standing right next to their nest.
Well, how many of your colleagues haven't come back?
We've got a good record so far.
What kind of protective gear did you wear when you were out on the Farallon Islands?
Yes, so you don't leave the house without a hard hat on. That's how protective they are of their nests. They will dive on you, and they also do know how to aim. So you also wear a raincoat that is specific.
Did you ever use any other protective gear, like shower curtains or anything like that?
These are leading questions. So you guys can figure that out. So studying seabirds, you come up with creative ways to protect yourself from them. Shower curtains.
Tell us about the one.
This is a little off, but when I walk my dog, a seagull's there, she doesn't mind. A snowy plover's there, she doesn't mind. But she's a crow, and she's like, "Get out of here, crow!" What's different about crows than the rest of the birds in this area?
She's a very conscious dog about what species she should leave alone and which ones are plenty of.
Crows need to get out of there. All the rest of them are fine. Seabirds are cool, but crows, guys.
That's funny. Yeah.
So I'm curious, because you have all this amazing data. And I would like to know if the seabird population has been affected by climate and what the numbers are. Are they down?
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is it's complicated, but also, yes, they're definitely affected by climate change. And we do we can see some short-term improvements based on how things are changing. But for example, in Alaska, where you are seeing kind of the climate change most rapidly, there's just been years of, these huge seabird colonies, so just rock faces full of them, and none of them are successfully breeding. So so it's definitely, you can definitely see it, and that is something that as seabird researchers we keep in mind when we're thinking about a few birds potentially being affected by an offshore wind turbine. What is the what is the end goal here, and how are we going to get there?
Thing to do.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
can you explain the day in the life of one of these storm petrels? Do they spend days at sea before they come back to their nests, or weeks or months, or they hang out most of the time in the ocean?
Yeah, months, and almost the entire year at sea.
And they just stay on the surface of the water?
Yeah, they can sleep while they're flying.
Say while they're flying?
Yeah.
They don't land on the water.
They do. It's usually thought to be socializing more than they're more vulnerable there than they are in the air. So then they come to land to breed. When they're breeding, they exchange duties at night. So one bird comes in, the other leaves to forage for itself or the chick, and they alternate about every night.
How can you possibly know they're sleeping?
I do not know. That is not something I've studied. The thought is that their brains rest at some point.
So are these nesting pairs lifetime nesting pairs? That's one question. And the other is, do they go back to the same nest year after year?
That is a really good question. That is seen in other seabird species, and it's just so hard to follow nests that we really don't know for storm petrels.
One egg?
Yeah, one egg.
For this species, what's the biggest ecosystem service that we risk to lose if we lost this one species to the wind turbines?
So, good question. So actually storm petrels. Maybe, maybe nothing super noticeable. That's a really good question, and I don't think I know.
So if after all the work you guys do, it's like, okay, you can build the wind turbines, but it's just this one species that will kill off. Like you won't have any. But I don't want that to happen. But I'm just saying, will there be any case to say no turbines because of this one species?
Yeah, no. I mean that's a really good thought exercise, right? It's just comes down to when do you stop making those exceptions, I guess. Yeah.
So you're obviously studying wind turbines a lot because they are something close to the coast. But what are some of the other big threats to birds that we do along the coast besides turbines?
Yeah, good question. I mean, along the California coast, we're pretty well protected. The Farallon Islands really, and actually storm petrels specifically, could really benefit from mouse being removed from the island, which has been hit a lot of roadblocks. But a lot of their colonies are protected in California. One thing that just in general people can do is be aware of the plastic pollution. Almost every dead bird that seabird that we dissect has plastic in it, because it looks like food to them floating on the ocean. So be mindful of plastic pollution, and then be mindful of invasive species if you're somewhere like Hawaii, and cats and rats can be a real problem on these islands, even the bigger ones with themselves. Does that answer your question, kind of? Any other questions?
Did sailboat racers feel guilty for their ecological impact?
No. In the grand scheme of things, you guys are doing it right. I'm the one out there with the motor on my boat.
Yeah, I have one more question. What's your favorite experience you've ever had in the field?
Oh, that's a good question.
What's your favorite bird?
Okay, favorite experience. I really think that the offshore rock work was one of the coolest things I've done. There's, it's like what the coast would look like if we didn't have ice plant. There's all these like old debris. Like there's just, these islands are really special. And then my favorite species is probably castle and softwood.
All right, I didn't mean to steal my theme, but she's our last speaker for the year. This is our 10th year doing the WIS seminars.
Wow.
And she's been extraordinarily flexible with me this season on timing and everything. Really appreciate you coming out. She's also a sailor. She comes from a long history of sailors. So we got to get her out in the water this spring. So grab her and get her on board. And we have a special gift for her for being so accommodating. A friend of mine had these printed up, and because the yacht club owns a sailboat, I don't know if you know about it. You own a sailboat charter for free for members. So we had a little cool deal he's made up. It says Tara. So if you're a member, you take the boat out. A friend of mine might give you one of these. So this is the best thing I got in my pocket for you. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, and another round of applause.
This will definitely, so I assume Tara's the boat.
Tara's the boat.